Wonderful. Okay, our next speaker is Gil Rodman. He is Associate Professor of Communication Studies here at the University of Minnesota. His major research interests include popular culture, communication technologies, intellectual property, and the politics of race and ethnicity. He is the author of Why Cultural Studies from 2015, Wiley Blackwell, and Elvis After Elvis, Routledge 1996. He's also the editor of The Race and Media Reader, Routledge 2014, and co-editor of Race and Cyberspace from Routledge from 2000. He's currently working on a book entitled Creating While Black, A Racial History of Copyright in the United States. His talk is entitled Reminds Me of Something, Prince and the Racial Politics of Copyright. Please welcome Gil Rodman.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks to Arun for having me up here. And your slip was actually right. Racist is going to come in here as well. Arun originally asked me to be on this panel to offer a critical media studies perspective on the music industry and copyright and racism, and to explain how all of these things connected to Prince. And if I were going to do all of that justice, we would need the length of time that Prince would normally play in concert to begin to cover it. And I've got officially about as much time as it would take to do 2 songs, which is fitting, since I actually want to frame my comments with 2 particular Prince song moments. And the first of these comes from one of those things we're not supposed to have heard, Prince's last concert, which he opened with a version of the Staple Singers' When Will We Be Paid? And in the Staples' hands, this was a straight-up civil rights protest song, a demand for reparations to the black folks who had built this country from Jamestown through Jim Crow. And all of that is still there in Prince's version. But given his public feuds with record labels and streaming services, his take on the Staples classic can also be read as a stinging rebuke to the music industry and its historical mistreatment of black artists. And it's a well-deserved rebuke, one very much in line with how people typically think about the relationship between musical copyright and race. That is, they point to the many ways that a white-dominated music industry has abused and exploited and stolen from black artists over the years. For instance, white producers and managers and DJs and archivists have formally claimed songwriting credit and thus royalties for music actually created by black artists. The industry has stiffed black artists on royalty payments far in excess of the rate that white artists have been stiffed. And let's be clear here, the industry has also stiffed white artists, so that's not a small claim. And the industry has under-promoted black artists and over-promoted their less talented white imitators in ways that have denied black artists fame and fortune that rightly should have been theirs, and so on. We could go on for 2 or 3 hours on that, too. The list of injustices here is long and it's ugly, and Prince knew enough of that history to fight against it when he could. It's at the core of his original dispute with Warner Brothers, the one that led him to change his name to a symbol and write slave on his face. He fought long and hard to regain and retain legal and economic control over his music, knowing full well that such control had historically been denied to most black artists. In asking the musical question, when will we be paid, Prince was, among other things, calling out an industry that was built on the backs of black artists, from ragtime to jazz to R&B to soul to funk to hip-hop, but that also routinely and systematically neglected and neglects those artists. There is real injustice here, and over the course of his career, Prince was one of the most outspoken and militant artists to push back against the industry on these issues. At the same time, however, I think that Prince fought the wrong battle here. Not, mind you, because his cause was not righteous. It was. But because he fought the industry largely on its terms. Who should get paid for this music? When the real problem I want to suggest runs much deeper than that. The problem here is not that copyright is somehow a noble legal and economic tool that's been abused by a racist industry. The industry is racist. But the deeper problem is that at its very core, copyright is built on fundamentally Eurocentric notions of property and authorship and creativity. Now, this is true for any form of copyright, but it's especially obvious when it comes to music, where the aesthetic qualities that are well protected by the law are precisely those that lie at the center of European musical traditions. Melody, harmony, lyric, which is why Maserati cannot get paid. While rhythm and meter and timbre, the aesthetic qualities at the core of African and African American musical traditions, are not protected by the law very well at all. Beyond that, copyright rests on the ultimately untenable fiction that real creativity, scare quotes around real, involves nothing like influence or homage or reinterpretation or remix, that people somehow make new art without ever drawing on or engaging with or reworking other people's art. And here's where I want to turn to my second musical example. There's a moment, about 2.5 minutes into Get Off, where Prince growls. Reminds me of something James used to say. We hear an old school crackle of a well-worn vinyl record, then the main horn riff from JB's Mother Popcorn, while Prince utters, and forgive me, misquotes lines from the original song. I like him fat, James evidently liked him tall. I like him proud, you gotta have a mother for me. Now it's not clear if the horn riff is a digital sample, or a feed from a turntable, or a convincing recreation of the original sound by new musicians. And since this is Prince we're talking about, I'm not willing to rule out the latter. But the homage to the Godfather is even more obvious than when Prince borrowed the main guitar hook from Papa's Got a Brand New Bag to use as the main guitar hook for Kiss. Part of why it's unclear whether Get Off contains a sample or a scratch or a recreation is because there is no formal credit given to Brown in the album's liner notes, which claim that all the music and lyrics, including Get Off, were composed by Prince and the New Power generation. And the JB quotation, regardless of its actual provenance, gives the lie to that claim. Now, to be as clear as possible, I am not pointing to this moment in Get Off as an example of musical quote-unquote theft on Prince's part. Quite the contrary. It would be very hard for most people to confuse Get Off with Mother Popcorn. The sample in question represents a very small slice of both songs, and Prince is explicitly paying tribute to one of his major musical heroes. At a cultural level, the line between what we would think of as legitimate influence, borrowing, and illegitimate influence, stealing, is a very fuzzy, very slippery, very complicated one. But I'm comfortable with placing this particular example squarely on the good side of that line. Nonetheless, at a legal and economic level, those nuances don't matter very much. Had James Brown, or more likely, Polydor Records, decided to take exception to what Prince did here, neither the industry nor the courts would necessarily have seen Get Off as an acceptable form of musical tribute, since there is no provision in either the Copyright Code or existing case law where I was trying to pay homage to a respected elder works as a legitimate defense against charges of copyright infringement. Now put all these things together, and copyright has been especially cruel to black music. It has no way to deal appropriately with the blues, or jazz, or soul, or hip-hop, all of which depend, although in radically different ways, on the novel recombination of communal musical tropes, on collective improvisation rather than formal written scores, and on the use of direct quotations as a way of acknowledging and honoring important musical forebears. These are all culturally important, aesthetically innovative musical practices, but copyright is fundamentally incapable of understanding or respecting or protecting the aesthetic values and cultural traditions at stake in these practices. Now, Prince was a unique talent. He did not spring up out of nowhere, and this is where I actually want to talk about the other side of something that Shelby mentioned towards the end of her talk. Because his creativity depended in many ways on his ability to recombine things he learned from a vast host of other artists who had come before him. When he died, I did what a lot of people did. I turned to the music. His music most of all, of course, but also the music made by people who influenced him. Part of how I handled the shock of his passing was to make mixed CDs. And part of what came out of that process was a 2-disc set that I called The Village. 43 songs from artists who in an ideal world should have been part of any Prince tribute concert, but who had passed on before him. JB and the Staples and Jimmy and Nina and Barry and Dinah and Marvin and Rosetta and Sam and Etta and Curtis and dozens more. It took a village, a soulful, bluesy, funky, rockin', gospel-tinged village to raise Prince. Those mixes were a way for me to reflect on the musical traditions that he drew on and that he then extended. They also point to the ways that music has been made for centuries. long before there was such a thing as sound recording, much less a recording industry, long before music was turned into a form of property, a generator of profit, or a commodity. People make music. Other people hear that music and are inspired enough by it to make music of their own. This is how culture simultaneously holds on to a thread of history and tradition, while also managing to make itself anew over and over again. These are the practices that have tied multiple strands of black music together and given it much of its power for more than a century. But neither the industry nor the law are able to deal with that very well. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have